First John 3:8. So whoever makes a practice of sinning is of the devil, for the devil has been sinning from the beginning. So we have this idea of the devil is a sinner and that the devil has been sinning from the beginning. So a lot of people think, hey, that's a reference to Genesis. But either way, what and maybe even the devil is the serpent according to the writer First John. But in this case, what is the text teaching?
Okay, so I have to look into what's happening in this passage. What do the words mean? So, if you're
Hmm.
going to go into on from the beginning, that's an idiom, and it doesn't mean like at the beginning of time or from when you started counting. Um,
Okay.
it means it emphasizes long-standing consistency. It's always been that way. Um,
No.
uh, so the devil is a sinner and always has been. Um,
No.
the other, this is actually a very similar construct to a passage that you see in John 8, where he says that the devil is a liar and a murderer from the beginning.
Mm.
And there's a lot of question about what that is actually a reference to because it's very difficult to figure out who the devil supposedly murdered. Um,
Hmm.
the Satan character in the Old Testament never kills anybody except Job's children.
Right.
That doesn't really count because God told him to do it. Um, so it's not an Old Testament reference. And there, some people want to think it wants to refer to Cain, but that wasn't the devil. That was Cain. Even if Cain is the child of the devil, which is sometimes a tradition, that's still
Yeah.
not that. So the idea is more that this refers to typology. The devil
Mm.
is a liar and a murderer. So why is Jesus saying that? Um, does he have a specific lie or a specific murder in mind that he wants to
Mm.
reference?
Yeah.
Is he trying to tell something about the devil character that they don't already know? That you think this guy is a great guy, but I'm here to tell you. Um, and I don't think either of those are true. I think John 8 especially is a very long series of contrasting typologies of who are children of God, who are children of Abraham, who are children of the devil.
Mm.
And all of that is based on, it's not based on um, genealogy, who's physically descended from who. It has to do with child of, in this case, is who acts according to the way a follower or disciple of this person should. And if that's if that's what's going on, then
Mm.
calling Satan a liar and a murderer isn't necessarily informing the Pharisees. So the Pharisees aren't like, oh yeah, we're following Satan. He's a great guy. And Jesus is like, no, have you read this passage? He lied and he killed somebody. That's not what they're doing. They know who Satan is. They know he's bad. They know that anything bad that you can think of, which includes things like lies and murder, are the kind of things that his followers would do. So Jesus picks those specifically in this passage because lies and murder are exactly what he's accusing the Pharisees of. He says, you lot there, you say that you're children of God, but you're conspiring to kill me. You say that you're children of God,
Mm.
but you're teaching falsehoods." Um, so he says, "So you're a liar, you're a murderer, you're a child of the devil, who was a liar and the murderer, and always has been." And it's not talking about who the devil is or what the devil did. It's associating people typologically with something that they wouldn't want to be. The Pharisees don't want to be children of the devil. They know who that is. They know that's bad. That's a
Yeah.
meaningful insult to them because of that. And when you look at First John, it's doing exactly the same thing. It's talking about who are the children of righteousness, who are the children of devil. The
I
children of
see.
righteousness do good. The children of God, the children of the devil sin because the devil's a sinner. Same as the
Mm.
children of the devil lie and murder because the devil's a liar and a murderer. It's not looking for a specific instance where the devil
Mm-hmm.
sinned. Again, they know that. They know that that's part of what the character is. It's talking about what his children do, what his followers would do in a typological relationship. And again, this is a commentary on people who sin based on the idea that those people would not be happy about being associated with the devil, because nobody's happy about being associated with the devil.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
so I can talk a little bit about references to Genesis or lack thereof as well if you want to. Um,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. Might as well.
okay, so um, there is no reference in Genesis to the serpent being the devil. There's no reference in Genesis to the serpent sinning. There's not even any
Mm-hmm.
reference in Genesis to Adam and Eve sinning. That's
Mm.
all. That all comes in Second Temple post biblical reception,
Yep.
and it it does for a couple of reasons. Most of the time, it's because they want to use Adam and Eve's story as a recapitulation of Israel's story. It's they're kind of they have a bit of a laser focus on this idea of um, promise, uh, that promise, infidelity, punishment, and restoration. So
Mm-hmm.
when they're telling this story about Adam and Eve, they usually refer to a whole bunch of ideas of how they're going to potentially be redeemed, or um, and other times it still has to do with the nature of the story. So they're recapitulating Israel. That's one of the places where it comes from. But more importantly, since we're talking about the devil and the serpent, it is
Mm-hmm.
very, very rare in Second Temple literature for the devil and the serpent to be conflated into the same character.
Mm.
I found one text that did it, and it was actually based around a an extension of the Day of Atonement ritual, where sin is removed from humans and placed onto Azazel. And it takes
Yep.
that character Azazel from Leviticus, combines it with that same character in post-biblical reception of Genesis 6, where he's one of the sons of God who descend from heaven in Genesis 6, and then conflates both of those with the serpent character. That's the only one I could find that did it. Usually they're two different characters, and sometimes they're not both even there. So the idea that the devil is the serpent and that's obvious is not something that you get in the background of the Bible, and it's not something you get
Mm.
in the Bible itself. I didn't find the first place where someone did say it, but it's again, I guess I did in the when they're Azazel in the Apocalypse of Abraham, but um, it's not common, and it's so a casual reference to Satan would not automatically invoke the serpent, and likewise, a casual reference to the serpent wouldn't automatically invoke Satan either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. 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 So really, I mean, you have, as far as just the specific passage goes, when we're talking about like what words are used and comparing what actually happens in the Genesis text, you have very little to go off of. So you have this idea of sinning, which isn't in Genesis
Isn't in Genesis?
for the devil. The devil in general, like that's speculative. At least whether First John thought that the devil was the serpent, and then you also have from the beginning the only possible like that maybe that's the clearest one, but you yourself and we have other texts that use this idea from the beginning to just refer to this, it's always happened that way as an idiom. So
This
there
isn't.
and none
Yeah,
of I was
yeah.
just
That
going to say that the yeah, go for it. What?
the the text in First John is not telling the audience what the devil is or did, or trying to identify a cameo of him in other parts of Scripture. It's
Yeah.
talking about who the children of the devil are, and how you can tell that they are the children of the devil based on the assumption that they know what that means and they know that that's bad.
Right, right, right. Okay, so Revelation 12:9 on a similar note, so it says, "And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world." So, this, can you talk about whether this is a reference to Satan as the serpent from Genesis?
So if you wanted to try to find a reference back to Genesis that puts Satan there, Revelation 12 is the best one you're going to get.
Hmm.
Um, and the reason for that is when the dragon waits to devour the offspring of the woman a couple verses later, that's very clearly a reference back to Genesis 3:15.
Uh-huh.
Um, and that's again a question of is this a retelling of a primordial event? I don't think that it is. It wouldn't be outside of an apocalyptic genre to do that, but in a couple of another reception of Genesis 3:15, it's the idea of God's people persevering against enemy onslaught, and it gets
Mm,
invoked in that context a lot. So this would seem to be more likely a comment in that same vein that whatever is happening between the woman's child and the dragon,
mm,
whoever they respectively represent, um, is one example of this same kind of God's people being subject to combat, but ultimately then being victorious that you see scattered throughout a lot of places. So
mm,
the question is whether does the dragon, the ancient serpent, is that a reference back to Genesis 3? And I don't think it is. Firstly, on the basis that the dragon and the serpent are, or the serpent and Satan are not usually conflated. So that would be not necessarily a thing that would naturally make sense. I think it's a reference back to Isaiah 27, where they're talking
mm.
about in those days, Lord will slay
Yep.
Leviathan, the coiling serpent, the gliding serpent, the dragon, and the sea. Um, Based on the language that it's using, so ancient serpent, a dragon that's an ancient serpent, and a dragon that's a coiling serpent is much more closer in terms of its language as a reference,
Yep.
especially in this context of a eschatological conflict, which is what's going on in Revelation, than a
Mm,
reference to the serpent was the wisest of the beasts of the field in Genesis 3. The language is different. So I also did argue in my book that the both the Leviathan and the Genesis serpent are samples of chaos creatures. So they kind of pool their imagery, and so they get the ideas are not entirely inseparable. But
hmm.
if it's a reference to Genesis, it's still a reference to Genesis. What they're talking about is what's happening to the dragon, what's happening to this offspring. If they're interpreting Genesis 3:15 as a prophecy, which they probably are, then maybe that's relevant. Does that mean that they're telling you to go back and fill in Satan when it says serpent in Genesis and then recalibrate your understanding of Genesis accordingly? I don't think that's what it's doing. That's not the point.
Mm,
Um, because it's a reference, it's a reference to something. We can argue about a reference to what, and this one you could theoretically make a case that it's a reference to Genesis 3. I don't think that's the best explanation, but it's a case you could make. It's still just a
okay.
reference. It's a passing comment, and it's the only significance you get out of Genesis is that, oh, Genesis 3:15 is relevant here, which you already
Mm,
knew because it already talked about the the dragon getting ready to smite the woman's child. So it doesn't tell you anything it would only tell you that this is a reference, and all that tells you is that's a meaningful reference. It doesn't add any information to whatever Genesis is talking about between the interaction of these two characters, and doesn't,
Mm,
because it's not a commentary on Genesis trying to help you identify who characters in Genesis are, then it doesn't really tell you anything about that either. One of the reasons why they think that's an important reference back to Genesis is because of the comment that the dragon leads the whole world astray,
mm,
or deceives the whole world, depending which translation you use.
mm,
And something that I did not actually find when I was writing the Demons book, but I found when I was doing my dissertation on Genesis,
huh,
is that that's not the same word that they use to refer to Genesis. So I want to say it's in Corinthians 11. There's a comment about uh, just as the serpent deceived Eve, I do not want you to be led astray.
yep,
Um, and so that shows that what they think the consequence of that's very clearly a reference back to Genesis. And it says that led astray is a consequence of what the serpent in Genesis did. Now, despite your English, that's not the same word it's using in Revelation 12. Babylon leads the whole world astray. But when the dragon slash devil comes out again and deceives the whole world and is let loose, and then is put in the abyss and is let loose again from the abyss to deceive the whole world, that's not the same. That's the same word as Revelation 12 again. They're not the same word as what Corinthians said the serpent did to Eve. So that's the deceives there that it says in English, the serpent deceives. That
mm,
is not a reference to Genesis because they're using the wrong word. And it's also not the word when in the Greek translation of the Bible when Eve says the serpent deceived me and I ate. It's not that word either.
mm. Okay, all right. So, if we're talking strictly, I think you could say that it's theoretically possible that they're thinking of the same ideas, but we would expect them if they're referencing that to use the same word.
They'd be
Is that
quite explicit about it. And again,
yeah,
we have plenty of texts that are commentaries on Genesis that are explaining what actually happened in the garden and what the significance of that is.
um,
They're not in the Bible, and most of those do not have the serpent and the devil being the same character.
mm, right,
Um,
right, right, right.
so it's there might be again. There's one I found one that does. There may have been more. That may have been an understanding that they had. We know it's an understanding that they developed
Yep,
eventually. It's never explicitly the point of any text in the Bible that might or might not happen to mention it.
yep. It's okay if you're not prepared, but Revelation 20 verse 2 also has a kind of similar point. It says, actually, no, that was Revelation 12:9. Let me repeat that. Revelation 22 says he sees the dragon, the ancient serpent, who is the devil or Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years.
Again, I think that's a reference to Isaiah 27,
Yep,
um,
yep. Hmm.
because the language is more similar than to Genesis 3. And again, they want to latch in on the whole leads astray or deceives bit, but like I said, that's a different word,
Hmm.
and that's a confusing feature of English. But I'm assuming that they didn't use the same word, or it's reasonable to assume that they didn't use the same word for a reason. If they had wanted to make that a reference, they could have.